Antonio Zaragoza Zuniga, Tony to his friends, was born, reared, and educated in South Texas. He has been in the field of radio, electronics, and television for the past 35 years. He is presently employed as the operations manager for Westinghouse Broadcasting TV station in Philadelphia, station KYW-TV3. Tony is a constant lecturer and a motivational speaker in both English and Spanish, in churches, corporations, schools, universities, not only in the United States, but in Mexico and in Puerto Rico. In addition, he told me that he is also the father of 9 children. So I suspect that this parenting is what also made it possible for him to be a regular consultant on human relations in the problems among Hispanic Americans, California, Indian Americans, and also for the migrant workers outside of Denver. Tony's talk today in God's Hidden Treasures will touch on 5 areas of our lives where God himself has hidden and buried his heavenly and earthly treasures that he has reserved for us. Tony will show us the beauty we receive while searching for them and the transformation in our lives when we discover them. Tony will also describe the daily miracles that can happen in our lives just by being ourselves. From pebbles to stones to precious jewels, our lives will unfold in like manner to receive God's greatest hidden treasure, his perfect plan for our lives. The most amazing thing is that it is easily accessible to everyone, since it is always within us. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Tony Zuniga.
Good morning, or good afternoon. I was just telling her and Bob up there at the door that I wanted to thank you for the beautiful weather you gave me. When I left Philadelphia, it was 3 degrees above zero. And here I'm coming to California with a big overcoat and a jacket and sweater. I remember 5 years ago, I was in Puerto Rico in 1976 giving one of these seminars. I also do in my spare time a seminar, Attitude Awareness Assessment Seminar. It's a discovery, self-discovery, self-esteem. I had to give it in English or in Spanish, and I was in Puerto Rico conducting one of the seminars, and at the end of the seminar I decided to take a couple of days vacation. I was walking through the beaches of Puerto Rico. I was looking for a special palm tree. You see, 30 years before, I was working for Pan American Airways down in San Juan, Puerto Rico. I was single at the time, and it was the first time that I had been away from home. And in my lonely moments, in my free time, my days off, I used to sit under this palm tree right on the beach. Some of the most beautiful letters that I think personally I wrote were written under that palm tree. Some were written to my mother, who is now dead, and the others were written to my girlfriend, who is now my wife. But I was looking for this palm tree, I guess, just to kill a few memories or revive a couple of more. And as I was walking, I found the palm tree. It was still there, but there was a young American girl sitting in the same place where I used to sit. She was about, 17, 18 years old, blue eyes, blonde. And as I was approaching her, I noticed that she seemed to have the whole cares of the world on her shoulders. She seemed perturbed. She seemed like something was definitely bothering her. And I felt like going up to her and telling her that life is really exciting. It's worth living, to forget about whatever it was. But she seemed to be scribbling something on a piece of wood. And then fear got the best of me, and I decided not to bother her, and I kept on walking. 30 minutes later, when I walked back, the girl was dead. She committed suicide right there on the beach. The 2 Puerto Ricans who saw her, they said that it was as if the ocean waves just kept calling her. It says, "Come, I will give you the peace and the tranquility that you are looking for." And she walked into the ocean, she got dragged in, and before they could save her, she drowned. I went up to where she was sitting down on the palm tree, and I found a piece of wood, and in this piece of wood she had written the following words: "I'm all alone with the me nobody knows." And she signed it Nellie. Two things happened in my life in that day. One was that I made myself a promise that I would never again pass the opportunity to talk to anyone, regardless of if I made a fool of myself, I will. If they tell me to go away, they do. If I bother people, I'll bother them, but I will never again allow the opportunity to talk to anyone at any time. And a lot of beautiful things have happened in my life because I have done this, and I'll talk a little bit later more about this. The second thing that happened was that, I guess, in all sincerity, the beginning of this workshop began on that day because I couldn't figure out why a young, beautiful girl of 17 years old would like to take her life. Something happened. And one thing in my mind and during my life and with my own children, I begin to see that perhaps we're missing the boat somewhere along the way. God has given us so many beautiful things to transform our lives, so many beautiful treasures, that maybe we just don't see them. And they happen from day to day. They happen around us, within us. So I guess the results of what you're going to hear today happened because of that incident. I was in Atlantic City last year giving the same type of workshop to 300 couples in the Marriage Encounter group. And when I got through talking, a young Puerto Rican couple came up to me and says, "Tony, the talk was good, it was beautiful, we understand it, but why did you call them hidden? They're really not hidden treasures." He says, "They're right there." And I asked him, I said, "Well, then why don't people just grasp them, take advantage of them, use them, become part of what God has given us?" He says, "I guess they don't see them." I said, "Well, that's why I call them hidden then. They must be hidden from us, from our sides, from our minds, from our hearts." Anyway, before I do start with the workshop, let me tell you what brought me to California. And it was not an airplane. It was really the love of people, I guess, something I inherited from my father. But my life has been progressing, and I'm grateful to God and to many other people who have helped me along the way. And I have to share this with you before I begin the workshop. One is I'm very grateful to the woman that God has put in my life. The old philosopher, Greek philosopher Socrates used to say that every man in the world should be married. He says, by all means, all men should get married. He says, if you got a good wife, you got nothing to worry about. And if you got a bad one, then you become a philosopher like me, and that's good for every man. Well, I'm not a philosopher. But after 33 years of marriage and 9 beautiful children, and the reason I call them beautiful is not because they're my children, it's because of what each one is doing with his or her life. 12 years ago, I was sitting at a luncheon cafeteria with the Philco Ford Corporation. At that time, I was working for Philco Ford. And the conversation got around to the high cost of sending your children to college. One guy was complaining because he had one daughter and it's costing him a fortune. Another guy had 2 children and it was costing him a fortune. And they all looked at me and says, "Poor Tony, with 9 children, he'll never be able to afford his children a college education." Today, 4 of my kids have graduated from college. My oldest boy with a PhD from MIT, majoring in physics. 2 others are attending college, and my wife will be graduating from college this May. So people ask me, how, why? I says, well, there's a will, I guess there's a way, but I just take one day at a time, and it seems to work out. But more than that, the thing that has brought my life to what it is today, I guess, has been 4 thoughts that I'd like to share with you. The first one came from my mother because since my very early childhood, she used to tell me, don't ever forget the one who gives it all to you and the one who can take it away from you. Get in the habit of telling Jesus Christ that you love him, not only with words but with action, and then teach this habit to your children and to everyone you meet. The second thought came from my father, who also at a very early age used to tell me, don't ever forget, son, it makes no difference where life or destiny takes you. What you do for yourself will die with you, but what you do for others will live on forever. The third one came from my wife. I was 22 years ago, I was working in Korea for the Philco Ford Corporation, installing television stations. And one day when I was feeling very sad and lonely, a letter came from my wife. It was more than a letter, it was just a piece of paper that I glued on the door of the bachelor officer's quarters where I slept, so I could read it every night before going to sleep and read it every morning before going to work. And it said, all things are possible to him who believes, less difficult to him who hopes, but more easy to him who loves. And the last thought that has changed my life, I guess, has been the late Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen. I got a chance to talk to him and meet him several times when he came to the Mike Douglas show. I worked for the Mike Douglas show 10 years when we were in Philadelphia. And I used to meet all the movie stars and important personalities. And Bishop Sheen once said, Tony, he says, wherever God is outlawed, there men will be subjugated. Which means that if we really believe that we can get along without God, without counting on God, without depending on God, we're going to be subjugated and enslaved within ourselves. And with that, let's go on to the workshop, God's Hidden Treasures. Last week, at the beginning of this week, rather, I took my family up to the Redwoods here in California. It's the first time I've seen these gigantic, beautiful sequoia trees. I stood there awed and amazed at the beauty of these fabulous trees. I'm sure most of you have seen them. And then I remember that the first thing I was going to talk to you about was that the most beautiful thing that God has created, and you can live for 1,000 years, you can search the entire universe, not just this world, and you will never find a greater treasure, a more precious treasure, a more beautiful treasure than the creation of a human being. Right there, to me, is the greatest treasure that God has given us. But for reasons which are unexplainable to me and perhaps to some of you, we don't seem to realize the beauty that God gave us when he made us. To be nothing and to be something, I'd rather be something. Webster defines a treasure like a beautiful, precious thing, something that's highly esteemed. I guess in his own wisdom, when God made us, he was counting on that he really appreciates us. He really loves us. He made us beautiful. When he made me and you and you and you, he made the most beautiful thing in the world, bar none. So if that is so true, then what is the problem? I remember back a few years ago that somebody wrote a book called If Love is the Answer, then what is the question? I would like to ask the same thing. If life is the most beautiful thing we have, then what is the problem? Because if we can't find a solution, then we might as well join Peggy Lee when she wrote that song, If That's All There Is, then bring out the booze and let's keep dancing, if that's all there is. But there's got to be more to life. There has to be. I remember, I don't know whether any of you have had the opportunity to see the Broadway musical Carnival, which of course has been in New York on and off for many, many years. But in this story, briefly, it's the story of a young man who wants to become a dancer. And just at the peak of his career, trying to become a great dancer in his life, he was called to go to war, and he was wounded in both legs, so he came back from the war a cripple. But he kept pleading and begging, trying to do something with his life, and wherever he went, people just rejected him. He said, after all, he says, what can you do with a lame and a cripple? He says. But he says, please, I beg you, give me a chance, let me prove that I can do something. Finally, a carnival arrived into town, and he went there again, pleading, begging, asking for work, and someone felt sorry for him and says, why don't we let him run the puppet show? After all he has to do is sit on a stool, move those wooden-like figures with some strings, and project their voices. Well, they gave him a chance, and he became so perfect, so professional in this ability, because he had such a desire to do something with his life, that in one particular scene, he would have this little wooden puppet walk out in front of the stage, and people would come from miles and miles around just to see that scene, because it seemed as if he was projecting his entire life into this wooden-like puppet. And then the puppet would look around, and then he would speak. Listen, my friends, I could have been like the rest of you, but I got to find the reason for being on this earth. I got to find the reason for taking the space I take and breathing the air I breathe. There's more to life, there's more to me. There has to be more than just suck the breath from weeds and leaves and trees. Yes, I've got to find the reason for being on this earth. Something to do, something to be, somehow to say, this is me. Right there in that incident, in that little scene, I guess this puppeteer was trying to tell us what we're all searching for, that we want to be recognized. We want to tell the world, listen world, listen friends, listen everyone. I'm here, I'm alive, and I can do great things. Just give me the chance, give me the opportunity. And if you, as human beings, as the most beautiful treasure that God has made, do not take advantage from day to day to be open to what God sends you, you're going to miss the most beautiful thing that God can do for each one of us. Was anyone here on Friday, and did any one of you take the opportunity to go hear Bruce Reeder, Father Bruce Reeder from New York City on Friday? He gave 2 workshops on sex and child pornography. Father Bruce Reeder, I have to tell his story, and I hope you'll forgive me, but Father Bruce Reeder, I met him last year. I had to go to New York. I just drove unexpectedly, knocked on his door, and I said, I had to shake your hands. I had to embrace you. I said, I have to admire you. What you're doing is fantastic. 5 years ago, he had no idea what he was going to do with his life other than he's a priest and he's supposed to serve and so forth. But he was walking home to his apartment on a cold, cold wintry night. And if you've never been in New York City on a cold wintry night, it seems like it's worse than the North Pole. And behind his apartment were 2 young boys sleeping in a barrel. So he invited them in. One was 13 years old and the other one was 15. He gave them something to eat and a bed to sleep. In the morning he gave them breakfast and the boys left. At night, those 2 boys brought 3 more boys. He said, there's a neat guy out there who can give us some food and a place to sleep. So now he had 5 to take care of. The following night, those 5 brought 5 more. And suddenly he realized that maybe God was leading him to something. Today, that was 5 years ago, but today, with the help from the state of New York, government funds from people like you and me, he has 5 houses, which he calls under 21. Means that he will not allow anyone to sleep or eat free of charge unless you're under 21. He takes care of 10,000 boys and girls under the age of 21 daily. He feeds and lets them sleep in his 5 homes. And the worst thing, he says, the thing that he's fighting constantly is this pornographic industry that's taking children, 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old girls and boys, selling them in the slave market, and when they don't need them anymore, they throw them off the roofs of 13-story buildings. He says, it's awful. He says, I'm only winning 25% of the battle. Now, the reason I'm telling you this story is not to tell you what he's doing, but listen to what he requires of volunteers, and he gets a lot of people who want to help him. And if someday you will apply, let me tell you what he demands of you. Right now, he has 178 volunteers. But the first thing is that you have to dedicate 1 year of your life to work with these boys and girls. And there's a lot of things to do: cook, sew, social workers, nurses, doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists. 1 year of your life you have to dedicate to be with him. He'll pay you room, he'll give you room and board and give you $10 a week. But more than that, he demands and expects you to pray in front of the Blessed Sacrament for 3 hours every morning before you go out and meet these boys and girls. Because if you cannot spend 3 hours with God and with yourself, you'll never be able to spend 3 minutes with his boys and girls. There's a challenge for anyone. But he's doing great things. Why? Because he was open to what God, he never dreamed 10 years ago that he would be involved with this. He is involved now, and that's what he's doing. Peter Marshall, I'm sure most of you saw the movie A Man Called Peter. Peter Marshall, who went on to become the chaplain of the United States Senate. He once made a recording, I have his cassette, in which he states that all his life, when he was young, he wanted to become a missionary in China. He could visualize converting hundreds and thousands of Chinese to Christianity. That was my whole ambition in life, is to go to China. And he went up in South Georgia, here in the United States. Later, many years later, he found out why God sent him to Georgia and to Washington. A lot of beautiful miracle things happened in his life. But what he was stating was, why don't you put your life in the hands of God? He knows us better than anyone else in the world. He knows exactly where he needs us, exactly what he can do with us, exactly who we should be. And that's the beauty of life. Now, God, in his wisdom, realized that even though we're alive, even though he created us, even though we are here, most of us have not appreciated ourselves. So he gave us a second treasure to go along with our lives, which I call the second greatest treasure, and this is our minds, the ability to think, to choose our own thoughts, to be able to make decisions, to be able to project whatever we want to with our lives. As most of you people here know, and I'm sure that you do know, that there is a so-called conscious mind and the subconscious mind. The subconscious takes care of all our bodily functions. We're not sitting there worried whether you can breathe or not. You're doing it automatically. Wonder for a minute if you had to say, whoa, I got to breathe in and I got to breathe out, otherwise I die. And just the subconscious mind is supposed to take care of that. The palpitation of our hearts, pumping of our blood, the blinking of our eyes, any movement, it's almost automatic. The fact that we are hungry and we can sleep and dream. But I'd like to talk a little briefly about our conscious mind, the one that if I decide to walk out in this moment and leave you sitting here, I could do that, but I won't. But this is the conscious mind that will allow you to get up, sit down, or you say, I'm going to go get a cup of coffee or a Coke, or I'm going to drive tonight or not drive or whatever. Because Viktor Frankl, which most of you perhaps read his book, and I don't remember the name of his book, but he was the one who was nearly gassed with the other 6 million Jews during World War II by Hitler, and now has a very beautiful mode of psychology. He said, the greatest thing I guess that God gave me was the ability to choose my own thoughts. They stripped me completely nude, completely naked. They took everything that I owned, my old worldly possessions, and they shaved all my hair from my entire body. And if they had plucked out my eyes and cut my tongue and cut off my arms, they still could not take the ability for me to choose my own thoughts. And that is quite a beautiful thing that God has given us. When you're able to decide in your own mind anything, and it makes no difference if you're right or you're wrong, because the idea is to make a decision. The greatest tragedy is for people who do not decide, because nothing moves. Everything becomes standstill when no decision is made. The beautiful thing that people are afraid of is, I'm afraid something will go wrong. You'll find out quicker if it's wrong. But number two, you can also change your mind and take another course in life and go another way. 20 years ago, when I first started in the Cursillo, I've been involved with the Cursillo movement for 20 years, and a priest from Ireland was giving a retreat, and I went to hear him. And in this talk, the priest was telling us a story about two young Irish lads who grew up together around the turn of the century. They had such a love and devotion for God that both made the decision around the age of 10 that they both wanted to become priests here in America. So they prayed, and they played together and went to school together. And finally, when they graduated from school, they told their parents of their dream to come to the United States and both become priests. The parents were, of course, highly excited, but they couldn't afford it. Finally, they got enough money to put them on a boat, counting on the grace of God that something beautiful would happen. Well, crossing the Atlantic or the ocean, they prayed every night, but just one night before they arrived in New York City, they came to a very deep realization that both of them could never be priests. Number one, they didn't know anybody in New York City. Number two, they didn't have any money. So they made a fast decision that one of them would go to work and support the other one in the seminary. That way, at least one of them could become a priest and serve God. They both asked themselves almost automatically, said, well, who will be the priest and who will be the one to go to work? He said, why don't we let God decide that? And they took a coin and they flipped it up on the deck of the ship. One of them chose heads and the other one tails, and they looked at the coin, and then finally one looked at the other one. He says, I guess you're the one who wins. You're the one who God wants to become a priest. And he hugged them. They arrived in New York. They said goodbye. He says, I'll support you the best I can. And the first year, second year, every week he would send money to the seminary to support his friend to become a priest. As life will have it, this young lad, the one who went to work, lost his vocation for the priesthood and got married. He fell in love with a beautiful Irish girl. And out of that marriage came 7 children. 4 of them were priests and 3 of them were nuns. And the priest who told the story said, I'm the one who was supposed to have won. He said, I'm the other lad. He says, the one who, my friend said, you're the one who wins. I ask you sincerely, he said, who really won? I guess God won. That's who won. My oldest daughter, just came back from Georgia 2 years ago. She decided to dedicate 4 years of her life working with the Glen Mary missionaries, working with the black people. I have a ingoing joke with her. She and I got along beautifully. I kid her a lot, and I says, now who in the world wants to work with blacks? Indians and Mexicans, that's different, but not blacks. Now, some of my best friends in Philadelphia are blacks, and I like to work with people. But anyway, she loves the black people. She went to Georgia, and she was a part-time newspaper reporter, and also she worked with daycare centers and orphans and the elderly. And when it was time to come back, I flew down to Georgia to help her drive and bring back all her personal belongings. And when I arrived there, I arrived on Saturday, just before Easter Sunday. He says, Dad, you have to come to this Baptist church. He says, if you've never been in a black Baptist church in Georgia, he says, it's a thrill. Besides, I want you to meet Mrs. Hill. So I says, who's Mrs. Hill? He says, that's the kind of person you love. He says, the kind of person that has done great things with her life. I says, good. That is my kind of person. When we got up at 4 in the morning to go to the sunrise services, of course, Mrs. Hill, very intellectual, very sharp. When my daughter says, Mrs. Hill, I want you to meet, and before she could finish, she says, you brought your brother with you. I said, I said, no, Mrs. Hill. This is my father. He said, he can't be your father. I said, Mrs. Hill, I said, I know now where you got your charm and your... Listen to this story. If you believe you've got problems, and we all do, Mrs. Hill, when she got married, she had 7 children, one right after another one. 7 years of marriage, 7 children. And when the last one was born, her husband ran away with another woman and left her all alone. And if you've never been left alone, much less with 7 children in the heart of Georgia, where there's practically no work, and being a woman, a black woman at that, what would you have done? I'll tell you what Mrs. Hill did. Today, her oldest son is a senator. The other son is a professor in the University of Georgia. Another one is a doctor. One of her daughters is a nurse. And I don't remember the other ones, but at least 4 of those 7 all of them have done great things with their life. And I asked her, I said, how, Mrs. Hill? You've got to tell me why, how, what's the secret? I just decided to take one day at a time, love my children, trust them, and turn them loose. Love my children, trust them, and turn them loose. You cannot hold on to your children. At one time, she admitted she was holding 4 part-time jobs per day, but she never gave up hope. This was her dream. All of a sudden, she was faced with 7 children that were her children, and she was not going to let the opportunity that God put in her way. The one, incidentally, who conducted the sunrise services was also her son. He's a minister down in Georgia. So what happens when God gives us life and we do not appreciate it, and then he gives us a mind so that we can decide for ourselves? I guess the third thing he gives us, if we throw away the opportunity to accept ourselves as we are and to take advantage of our minds, he gives us another beautiful treasure, which I like to call each other. You are the most beautiful treasure that God gave me today, and I hope to think that I am the one that he gave you today. In giving us each other, I guess God opened the door to helping each other, loving each other. I kept thinking of Nellie, the girl who committed suicide on the beaches of Puerto Rico, and remember I told you that I never miss an opportunity now to talk to anyone, anywhere in the street. Yesterday, as I was walking here to the convention hall, I saw a nun eating a candy bar sitting under a tree. I said, now that's a fine-looking chocolate candy bar. May I have a piece? And she looked at me kind of funny. She says, there's not enough for both of us. I said, then I'll eat it and you watch me eat it. But seriously, a lot of beautiful things have happened to me. I was running to catch a train in Philadelphia one afternoon, and as I'm walking by the streets of Philadelphia with my briefcase, up ahead, I saw what appeared to be a young girl, about 20, 21 years old, who had 2 or 3 balloons and had a little box like she was selling something or passing out something, and every time somebody crossed the street, she would approach them, but they would just ignore her. She saw somebody coming, and she talked to them, and they would ignore her. So as I was getting closer and closer, I went up to her. I said, "What are you selling?" She said, "My God, somebody's talking to me." So I said, "You mean people don't talk to you?" She said, "No." I said, "They're afraid I'll buy them." I said, "Well, what are you doing here?" She says, "I'm selling balloons and chewing gum." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, it's a long story." She said, "But I'll tell you." He says, "Last night my husband and I had a fight. He told me that I could never live without him, that he was the sole support of my life, and I told him he was wrong. I was going out to prove that he was wrong. So I went and bought these chewing gums for a nickel and the balloons for a nickel, and I'm selling them for a quarter, and I'm going to make my own living. I'm going to get my own education and prove to him that I can do it." I said, "You're on." I said, "How many do you have? I'll buy the whole thing." I said, "I don't like people like you." I said, "So you kidding me?" I said, "No." I said, "Here's $20. And she stood there flabbergasted, and she says, "I don't believe you. Who are you?" I said, "Forget who I am." I said, "Keep on doing and thinking the way you're thinking, because I admire people who make decisions like this, regardless of what they are." So she gives me the box of chewing gums, and here's my balloons and my briefcase, and I felt like a fool. So I said, "I'll tell you what I do. Keep the $20 and see if you can sell the rest." And I gave them back to her, and I kept on walking. I tell my wife and my children, he says, "You are crazy." I said, "Well, no." I said, "Maybe somewhere along the way, God will reward me somehow, some other." I remember another day, another incident. I was rushing to catch a train, as I'm always late. And a little black boy, about 7 years old, kept tugging me. He says, "Hey, mister," he says, "can you spare a quarter?" And I stopped and I looked at him. I says, "I'll give you $1 if you tell me what you want the quarter for." He said, "I'm hungry." I said, "You're hungry?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Look at my ribs." That little incident, that little statement, "Look at my ribs," and he looked kind of scrawny and thin. So I gave him $1, and "Oh boy," he says, and he runs into McDonald's, and I guess he was hungry. But sometimes not everything works out fine. In San Diego 2 years ago, a young boy, about 12 or 13 years old, approached me and said, "Mister, can you spare $1?" And he looked very dirty. And I said, "I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you $10 if you tell me what you want the money for." And he looked at me with pity and sadness, and then he said, "Never mind." And he runs across the street before I could even grab him or at least give him something. Many nights I've thought about him, and I wonder, maybe I should have given him the $1. But beautiful things can happen. Don't be afraid to be open to life. Talk to people on the train, on airplanes, wherever you see them, under a tree, workshops. I remember one incident. I went to lunch, and then I was supposed to be at a meeting at 1:30 in the office, and I was running late, and it was a very important meeting. And I was walking fast from the cafeteria, and all of a sudden, as I'm walking, almost running, I see a blind girl coming towards me. A real young, pretty blind girl with a cane. And just as I'm coming towards her, the last thing I heard was, "Can you help me with?" And her voice just trailed as I passed her. And I stopped briefly and looked back, and I looked at my watch, and I had to be at this meeting. So I kept on going, and it bothered me. But when I got to the office, they said they postponed the meeting till tomorrow. I got back on the elevator, came down, and ran down the street. And I asked the hot dog man at the corner, I said, "Did you see a blind girl?" I said, "I think she went that way." And I ran down to the next corner, and I asked the newspaper man, "Did you see a blind girl come here?" He said, "She went into this restaurant." So I went in the restaurant, and there she's sitting, drinking a cup of coffee. I went up to her, and I said, "Hi." "Oh," she says, "Hi." He says, "Who are you?" I says, "I came to apologize." She says, "For what?" I said, "Well, I was rushing by when you asked for some instructions or for some help, and I ignored you, and I felt bad about it." She says, "Why don't you sit down and have a cup of coffee?" I says, "Fine." So she asked me who I was, and I asked her who she was, and she said, I'm just visiting your beautiful city of Philadelphia. I'm from Orlando, Florida. I had a hard time," she says, "convincing my parents to let me come by myself, but I had to come. You see, I've always wanted to see the Liberty Bell." And for a moment, she caught me off guard. I says, to see the liberty, oh, it's the most beautiful thing. I says, I felt it with my fingers. It's just the whole history of independence, of Americans, the battles, the joys, the tears. It's all there. It's just, and I made up my mind right now, it's just to go back and tell my parents that I'm going to move to Philadelphia so I can write a book about all the beautiful things that you people here are missing. She left me thinking, here's a blind girl, completely, totally blind from birth, and she could see things that I couldn't see. It's beautiful when you meet others, and that's what God gave us in this hidden treasure, each other. Don't miss that opportunity. I'd like to read a letter that, I don't know who wrote it, but it has to do with people. This guy wrote it to his wife. His name is Joe, and his wife's name is Elizabeth. I guess he was appreciating this beautiful treasure that God gave him when he gave him his wife, Elizabeth. This is, my dear Elizabeth, I love you very much. I have always loved you, and I believe that I will always love you. But today, I had to tell you once again. I like to tell you also that I would like to take care of you for the rest of my life, and also of our children. I know that we're going to have hard times and good times, but I'm going to try to do the best I can with what I've got. Once in a while, I will probably exasperate you and bother you, but I will promise you one thing, you will never be bored. I read once, and I don't remember where, that the marriage contract is the only contract in the world that does not have a definite ending. One single point that can be ended or renewed. It simply says, until death do us part. I want you to know that in our case, I'm happy with that arrangement. But being perfectly honest with you, sometimes I wish that we were not married, so that each day, as we share our loves and our pains and our sufferings, we would know that we're doing this not because we have to, but because we want to. In either case, I'm sure God will smile upon us. Your loving husband, Joe. I promised my wife that I would tell this story. She didn't want me to tell it, but it's a beautiful story, and I don't like to talk too many personal things, but a lot of people have told me that I should write a book about it. Some people have even gone as far to say that a movie should be made about it. And it's a brief story. I'll try to condense it, of how I met my wife. The year was 1945. I don't know where you were in 1945, but I was getting ready to graduate from high school. The month was April, and a friend of mine, another Mexican friend of mine, came by one Sunday afternoon and asked me if I wanted to go to the movies. And I told him I didn't care to. I said, I got a lot of work to do for school. It's closing year. I'm a senior. I'm graduating. And I was valedictorian of the class. And he says, come on. He says, it'll do you good. So finally, he talked me into it. If I had not gone to the movies that Sunday afternoon, I would not be married to my wife today. As we went to the ticket office and we were ready to buy the tickets, my friend looks across the street and there's a panel truck that said, with big letters, your name engraved in gold. So my friend said, let's go across the street and see what this guy is selling. He says, I need to buy a present for one of my aunts. I said, look, forget that. I said, we're going to go to the movies. Let's go to the movies. He says, come on. He said, it will only take a minute. If I hadn't crossed the street with him, I would never be married to my wife today. While my friend is buying, the man in the truck, incidentally, was a crippled man. He lived in the truck, and he'd been traveling across country. I think he started in California, because on the panel, I guess that was the first incident of graffiti or writings on walls. All through the panel truck and the fenders and doors, young boys and girls were writing their names and addresses with little sayings like, I'm looking for a tall, dark, handsome guy who likes music. Please write me. And they would put Betty Compton or something in Oklahoma City. And some guys would say, I'm looking for a girl who loves to dance and likes to share music with me, Joe's Blokes or whatever in Arizona. And I kept amazed at the hundreds and hundreds of names on that truck. So my friend bought a pin. The guy was selling some gold pins. He would engrave with any name he wanted for a quarter. And finally I said, well, let's go to the movies. And I'm crossing the street, seriously, and my friend says, what kind of a girl do you want? Let's write our names here. I said, forget about that. I said, let's go see the movie. He said, what kind of a girl do you want? And I said, a green-eyed blonde that can understand my heart. I remember saying that, and I'm going to be honest with you. Right there, the whole incident just closed from my mind. I erased it completely, obliterated it. A month later, I get a letter from Tennessee. And my father, who brought it to me, says, who do you know in Tennessee? I said, I don't know anybody in Tennessee. So I opened it up, and it said, Dear Tony, I'm the green-eyed blonde you advertised for. Immediately, in my mind, because I was getting ready to play a joke on some of my friends, I was really serious. I was thinking of sending their names to a Lonely Hearts Club. And I said, oh, gone it, they beat me to it. Somebody sent my name to a Lonely Hearts Club, and I got scared. I panicked, so I immediately wrote her back. I says, I don't know who you are or what you want, but don't ever write me again. She wrote back and said, Jesus, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. She says, I thought maybe we could exchange some points of interest, some viewpoints. I could tell you some things about Tennessee, and you could tell me some things about Texas. I've never been out of the state of Tennessee, and I'd like to know more about what's going on down there. So I wrote back, I said, well, who are you? And I said, where'd you get my name? And she said, one Sunday afternoon, my girlfriend and I were invited, she invited me to go to the movies. And across the street, we see this panel truck. And I didn't want to go, but she talked me into it. We didn't buy anything from this man, and all of a sudden, in my mind, the picture is beginning to take form and shape. And she said, look at this, hundreds and hundreds of names. She says, why don't you pick a name and write him, and I'll pick a name and I'll write him. And I chose yours. I couldn't believe that. I was on my way to college, like I said, after graduation, so we wrote for a while. We exchanged graduating pictures, and then her letters followed me to college, and they followed me back home. And we wrote for 3 solid years without meeting. And after the second year, we wrote every day. I had a system in which I numbered the envelopes from 1, 2, 3, and we used to say, on letter 157, you used to say blah, 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 and she would we still have over 800 letters that she wrote and 800 letters that I wrote. In those 3 years, we discussed politics, religion, we fought, we cried, we argued, we fell in love. It got to the point where we talked on the phone a few times, but finally I was sent to Puerto Rico. I was working for Pan American Airways, and I told her it's about time that we meet. And 3 years to the day, I asked her to take vacation. She was working for the telephone company at the time. She never went to college. This is why now she's graduating in May. She took vacation, and I invited her to come to Puerto Rico. Now, in 1947, it's not what's happening today. In 1947, a young girl would not just get on an airplane and fly to Puerto Rico. Today, they fly all over the world, spend the weekend wherever they want to, but in those days, her folks wouldn't let her go. So I had to write them a letter and ask her that, I just wanted to meet her, that I would respect her, treat her nice, and just wanted to see what would happen, which was ridiculous. We were already in love. But she came to Puerto Rico, and of course we met and we fell more in love. And I'd like to conclude this story by saying that after 33 years of marriage, 9 children, marriages are not made in heaven, they're made on the side of panel trucks. Last Sunday, Dr. Schuler, right here, 2 miles away from the Crystal Cathedral, invited me and my family to be his guests at the Hour of Power show that they televised. I met him on the very last show that the Mike Douglas show taped in Philadelphia, and he was his guest. At that time, just before he went on the air with Mike Douglas, he told me and my son that the story of his daughter, Carol, who lost a leg. I think she was 16 or 17 years at the time. His daughter, Carol, wanted to become an athlete. She wanted to become a skier and a baseball player, and through a motorcycle accident, she lost her right leg. And he was in Korea at the time, and he flew back in a special jet plane to be with his daughter. And he was afraid. He says, of all the thousands and thousands of people, Tony, that I talk to every Sunday, every day, he says, here I don't know what I'm going to say to my daughter. And when he walked into the hospital, she smiled at her father and said, hi, Dad. He says, don't worry about a thing. He says, the loss of my leg will never change God's plan for my life. And this is the fourth hidden treasure that God has given us. No matter what afflictions, what suffering, what pain, what crosses you have, it will never change God's plan for your life or mine. And we all have problems, we all have frustrations, we all have tensions, we all have sickness and disease and everything else, but there's still something beautiful awaiting each one of us in God's beautiful plan to transform us. The main thing is not to let it get you into a negative situation in which you start going downhill. It may take a while. Sometimes it takes a long while. I don't know whether, I guess some of you do know, but a pearl is formed because a little grain of sand got inside the oyster and irritated the oyster. And the oyster, in trying to protect itself, emits a little fluid, covers this little grain of sand, and when it hardens, it becomes a pearl. And they say that the most beautiful pearls in the world come from the Bay of Hawaii in Japan. Why are they the most beautiful pearls in the world? Because that's the most turbulent sea in the entire world. The oysters are constantly being banged against rocks, against the ground, and constantly they're trying to protect themselves. And the more they're being hardened by or rather caused and irritated by this grain of sand, the more fluid they emit, the more they protect, and the most beautiful the pearl comes. The same thing happens with our lives. Even though I don't wish anyone pain and suffering, but the more pain that you carry with you in a positive way, the more beautiful your life will become. I was thrown out of many restaurants in Texas for being a Mexican. I've been in jail for being a Mexican. A lot of people still don't believe that in Texas they had places where they had 2 water fountains set for Mexicans only and for whites only. And I would be arrested if I drank out of a fountain where it said for whites. And I guess the most disastrous thing that ever happened in my life that could have ruined my entire life, I would not be standing here today. And I've never told this story before. You're about to hear it for the first time. It even took me a year before I even told my wife. And I usually tell my wife anything that happens to me almost immediately. When it took me a year to tell my wife, you can imagine. And I've never had enough guts to tell it as I'm going to tell it to you. But one night in Texas, I was the engineering supervisor at the TV station down in Texas. With my wife and my family had just gone to a movie, and I dropped them off, and I told her, since I was the engineering supervisor, that I was going to go and see how the station was going. This was on a Saturday night. I usually drop by and bought the guy some coffee. As I walked into the lobby of the TV station, there was a guy that I'd never seen before, 6'3", 250 pounds. And as I walked in, he says, "Are you Tony?" I said, "Yes, I am. May I help you?" And before I could even end the word "help you," his right fist was coming straight at my face, and all I had was an instant second to turn my face here, and he got me right across the left eye. And just like in a John Wayne movie, I went sailing through the air and hit a couple of lamps and chairs and went down on the floor. Blood, of course, there was a 2-inch gash here, and blood was spurting all over my shirt. I had no idea what was happening. He picked me up very roughly and dragged me all the way to the back of the studio. There was nobody in the building on a Saturday night. Everybody was in the master control room. And I couldn't even yell for help. I was confused. I was perplexed. I didn't know what was going on. And as he's dragging me out there, he said, "I'm going to teach you, Mexican, how we treat Indians in Oklahoma." And when he got to the back of the studio, there's a big full-length mirror where the actors and actresses look at themselves before going in the studio. He grabbed me. He knelt me down in front of the mirror. He grabbed me by the hair with his left hand and twisted my arm behind me, my right arm behind myself. And he said, "Repeat after me or I'll break your arm." He said, I am a no good Mexican son of a bitch. Say it over and over till I tell you to stop. Louder. Once more. Finally, he dragged me out to the alley, and I really thought he was going to kill me. And then I got the shock of my life. Instead, he takes me to a car that's parked in the alley, and there's a woman sitting in the front seat. When I saw the woman, I became even more confused. That woman had just gotten a job at the TV station. She had a show called Bible Stories for Children. She had just started a week ago. And I couldn't get the connection from the beating. The blood is still pouring out into my shirt. The humiliation that he gave me. He goes over there and says, apologize to my wife, he said. I says, for what? Finally I spoke. He says, you spoke to her. He says, when she came to work here. I said, I speak to everybody. He says, but you're a Mexican. Mexicans are not allowed to speak to white folks. And I knew it was useless. I was bleeding. I was in pain. He had kicked me once in the ribs, and I decided to give in. I said, I'm sorry. I apologize. I will never talk to you again. And then she said something that was worse than the beating and the humiliation he gave me. She said, Tony, why don't you grab your family and move way up north when you can mix up with the rest of the immigrants? And that way you'll be just another family with a funny sounding name. I decided that night that I would never allow myself to let this incident get me down, that I was going to do something with my life. When I was in Houston, Texas, installing all the television cameras, over 400 of them, and President Johnson came in there and congratulated me for the Mission Control Center. When I was in Korea, and General Decker and President Lee in Korea congratulated me for all the work I did, I kept thinking of all this little incident that was insignificant. But if I had allowed it to grab me and put me down, I would not be here today. I'm master of my own destiny, and you should also be master of your own destiny, regardless of what happens in your life. People used to laugh at me because I have 9 children, and I told you, I'm proud of each one of them. My son Lloyd, and it's a long story, perhaps some of you heard his story 2 years ago, but Lloyd gave us the hardest problems that any child could give a family. He's my number 5 son. He burned my garage down with a neighbor's car inside of it. He killed our cat accidentally on a hot summer night by putting him inside the refrigerator when he was 3 years old because he said the cat was hot. He ruined the family dinner that I had for my boss and his wife, and he put a lot of frogs inside the soup pail, and the frogs jumped all over the place. And they called me from the police station one day that they had Lloyd and a few of his friends in jail for stealing a case of beer. And I said, when I went to see Lloyd, I said, what do you mean stealing a case of beer? There's a country club right across the street from where I live. And he says, Dad, we didn't steal it. We just moved it from one side of the street to the other, and then we drank it. And many times, counselors, teachers, the principals called me to school. Lloyd is smoking. Lloyd's not here. Lloyd was talking. He's late. We talked to him, we prayed for him, we listened to him, we scolded him. And one day he went through one of my seminars, Adventures in Attitudes, this self-awareness motivational seminar. But I told him, I said, don't go to a seminar that I conduct. So he went and took it in New Jersey with a woman. Now, I'm not promoting the seminar here because people have to be themselves. But all the seminar does is allows you to find yourself the way you think you should find yourself, not your neighbor, not your father, mother, children, but yourself. When he came back after the seminar, Lloyd came back and says, Dad, he says, I know exactly what I want to do with my life. I says, what? He says, I want to be a cook. I looked at him, I says, what? He says, a chef. He says, I want to learn how to cook. And he felt hurt that I questioned it. I says, why? He says, Dad, he says, that's what I want to be. Forget it, he said, and walked out of the house, and then I felt bad. That night he enrolled in a cooking school, a 10-week cooking school. And many were the times that he came home and he says, I'm cook for the family tonight. Everybody out of the kitchen. And many were the times that he would come in and scold my wife, and he says, if you were working for me, I'd fire you. That's not the way to cook this. That's not the way. I says, oh boy, I says, what have we wrought? After the graduating from his cooking school, this is on his senior year in high school, he got a part-time job at the Hilton Hotel, washing dishes. And I asked him why. He says, because if I'm going to learn everything about cooking, I have to start at the bottom and go all the way to the top. 2 months later, he was in charge of making salads. Another month, he was in charge of making the desserts. 3 months later, he was assistant to the chef. and it felt like a balloon that was about to burst. I tell my wife, I don't believe this. All of a sudden, he found something he wanted to do. And then one day, as my wife and I are sitting, drinking coffee in the kitchen, Lloyd comes by and says, Dad, I just quit my job. And I said, why? Because it's time to go into phase 2 of my life. I said, you mean there's another phase? He looks at me again, a little indignant. He goes upstairs and brings back down his manual, his written manual of adventures and attitudes. He says, I have to do now what I was meant to do in life. And he opens it up to Project 65 and 66, where you are given the opportunity to write your 1-year goals, 3-year goals, 5-year goals, spiritual goals, material goals, monetary goals. And right there he wrote, 5 years from today, I will become the world's greatest guitar player. I says, what? I couldn't get the connection between cooking and playing a guitar. I visualized entertaining the customers from the kitchen or something. So he says, Dad, that's all I've ever wanted in my life. I said, how come you never told me? He says, you never asked me. So he says, I had to get cooking out of my life. He says, I just had to prove to myself that I can cook, and I do now. Secondly, I wanted a part-time job to make money so I could buy a guitar. And he reaches in his pocket and takes out $600. I didn't know he had saved. He says, but the guitar I want, Dad, costs $1,500, and I want you to put the rest. I said, $1,500? I says, I've never bought a $50 guitar for myself. He says, Dad, if I'm to become the world's greatest guitar player, I have to have the world's best guitar. My wife said, you're going to argue with that? So here we go, trudging down to Philadelphia to the 8th Street Music Store to buy a $1,500 guitar. But I'm going to be very honest with you. If all the time, the energy, the money, the trouble that I've been through with this program in the last 7 years was just to see the changed attitudes of this son of mine, was well worth it, because today, since this was 2 years ago, he still practices the guitar 4 to 6 hours a day, 7 days a week. He never misses, except for this time that he came to California. And he puts a sign on the door of his bedroom, do not disturb me for anything unless the house is on fire. One time I called him to dinner. I said, Dad, can't you read? He says, the house is not on fire. I don't want to eat. I just want to sit here and practice my guitar. He also made another beautiful sign on his bedroom wall that says, anything can be achieved in life if you're willing to pay the price for it. And I asked him what that price was, and he said, hard work and sacrifice. I'm proud of Lloyd, not because of what he's doing with his life, but what he is doing with the lives of others. Today, other young people his age are following Lloyd. He is majoring in music in college. 2 or 3 kids who never wanted to go to college are now attending college because of Lloyd. 2 or 3 kids who didn't know what to do with their lives are now taking up music because of Lloyd. But the greatest thing, I guess, that Lloyd is doing for me is that every morning he wakes me up at 6 a.m. when I'm trying to sleep. He says, wake up, Dad, this is the greatest day that God has given us. Great, beautiful things are going to happen today. I said, oh my God, every day he's excited about life. And 2 years ago, when I took the whole family to Puerto Rico, and on that particular morning when we were ready to go to the airport, Lloyd comes down from his bedroom with a T-shirt, jeans, and sneaks. And his older brother, who was not going to Puerto Rico, the ones in college, looked at Lloyd and said, you're not going to Puerto Rico like that. Lloyd looked at himself and said, what's wrong? His brother said, you really want me to tell you? I said, sure, said Lloyd. He said, you look like a slob. And I said, uh-oh. So then Lloyd looked at his brother and says, why do you look at my outward appearance? Why don't you look at my heart and my soul? I couldn't argue with that one. But the greatest thing that Lloyd did for me too was, my wife and I usually sit in the kitchen and drink coffee and talk. Lloyd came by one day and says, unexpectedly, he was just walking through, stops and says, Dad, Mom, he says, I just had to tell you this. He said, I just came from seeing a friend of mine and he's trying to run away. He's trying to commit suicide. His parents are fighting, they're arguing, they're drunk. I come here and there's peace, love, and contentment. I'm so happy that I was born in this family. I just had to tell you. And he walks by and my wife says, gee, is this really the Lloyd we used to know? Anyway, pains and crosses sometimes, not sometimes, anytime, can become something beautiful in our lives. And to finish this off, if you miss the boat, as I said before, if you miss the boat not realizing that God made you beautiful, he gave you a life, that he gave you a mind, that he gave you other people to count on, to be with, to love, and he gave you crosses and pains and suffering that you can transform and exchange for beautiful, beautiful, beautiful things in life, then the last thing that can solve all of this is just by giving ourselves away. When everything else fails, just give yourself away. Let me tell you what happens. When you give yourself away, God gives himself back to you. When I was going to take the Crucillo 20 years ago in New York City, there were two Puerto Ricans in the car that I was riding with, and one Puerto Rican was singing real happy, real joyful, and one of the other new candidates with myself said, "Jesus, where did you get so much joy, so much happiness?" And this Puerto Rican in the front seat said, "I discovered the secret of happiness." And that got me, and I asked him myself, I said, "What is the secret of happiness?" He said, "I've discovered that if I worry, sacrifice, and go out and do God's things, God is going to worry, sacrifice, and do my things. And I have nothing to worry about. In other words, I'm just concerned with God's will, and he will be concerned with my will." Let me finish with this last story, because a lot of people also insisted. There were a few friends that want me to tell this story again. I guess the most beautiful thing that has happened in my married life has been a Christmas that I will never forget. A lot of people also have told me that I should write this story because it's a story of faith. And this faith came the year after I returned from Korea. Let me tell you briefly the background. I went to Korea simply because I got myself in very heavily debt. I owed money just about everywhere, and I couldn't get myself out of debt. My finances were awful. I was making $95 a week. I had 5 children. We were expecting our 6th. I was in one hell of a mess, to put it bluntly. And we prayed. My wife and I prayed for a whole month. And then this job in Korea opened up, in which I was given the opportunity to install television stations, and the salary was 5 times more than I was making. And everything seemed to fall in place. So I went to Korea. And when I was there in Korea, I decided to give myself completely to God. I worked with the Colombian missionaries, with orphan homes, in a leper colony. I helped just the Koreans, students, engineers. It was just one complete gift from myself to God, to the point that at the end of my tour in Korea, I came back with such a strong faith, the kind of faith that can move mountains, literally, that nothing bothered me. But I paid all my debts, and when I came back, they moved my entire family from Texas to Philadelphia, and that's when I started working in Philadelphia. Well, trying to get the children in school, trying to buy a car, trying to establish credit, trying to open up a bank account. Christmas is upon us, fast. And my wife said, "What are we going to do for Christmas?" And I said, "Don't worry, God will take care of it." She said, "Wait a minute, don't give me that," my wife said. She says, "Do we have to do our part?" He says, "Don't worry." I says, "God." And before we know it, it's December the 1st, and it's December the 15th, and I don't have any money. We were living from day to day, from paycheck to paycheck. I had not a penny left. And my wife is concerned. She's worried, sick. She says, "What are you going to tell the children on Christmas morning, that there are no toys? When are we going to buy a Christmas tree?" December the 20th, 21st, December the 22nd. And I haven't done a thing. And finally, on December the 24th, as I'm going to work, my wife looks at me one more time and says, "You better be ready to tell these children what happened. This is when they wake up tomorrow morning on December 25th and there are no toys here." I says, "God will take care of it." I really counted on God. I gave 1 year of my life to God, and now it was time for God to come to my rescue. That's the way I looked at it. And I had $10 in my pocket, and just as I'm leaving, I told my wife that I was going to work half a day. I says, the company allowed us to go home at noon so we can do last-minute Christmas shopping. She said, "Will you take that $10 and buy a small Christmas tree and a turkey so we can have a family dinner together?" And I told her in a very nonchalant way that I would, and got in the car and went to work. At noontime, after we said Merry Christmas to each other, and I got back in my car, suddenly the realization and the impact of the seriousness of the situation hit me. I said, "My God," I said, "in less than 12 hours, it'll be Christmas Day, and I haven't done a thing. I hadn't bought my wife anything. I hadn't bought anything." Suddenly, my faith is going away fast. And I'm driving down Roosevelt Boulevard, and I see a Catholic church there on the side with people going in and out of confession, so I decided to stop the car. This was 22 years ago. And I said, I got to renew my faith. So I walked into the church. I see people coming and going. Just as I'm walking in, I remember the story that my father told me, and then I heard it in the Cursillo about this farmer who made his living planting tomatoes. He used to have a big crop of tomatoes. And every year he would go out and plant his crop of tomatoes. And when he got through planting them, he would kneel down on top of his hill and says, Lord, don't forget, this is that my family and I make our living from these tomatoes. So my tomato plants need water. Don't forget to send some rain, please. That night it started to rain, and it rained the next day, and it rained the next night. Suddenly his tomato plants are about to be washed away, so he goes back to the hill. He says, Lord, please. He says, they also need sunshine. They need sun. They need warmth. They need energy. Well, the next day the sun came out, and it's the third day, the second day, and the third day. Finally, the fourth day, the sun was so hot that it scorched the entire tomato crop. And it burned them all up, and he went up to the hill and said, God, you ruined me. And he heard a voice from heaven and says, I didn't ruin you. He said, you ruined yourself. You asked me for rain, and I gave you rain. You asked me for sun, and I gave you sun. But you never asked me for a good tomato crop, so I never gave it to you. So I went to the altar, I knelt down. I says, God, I need toys, I need a tree, and I need a turkey. But I says, why don't you make this the most beautiful Christmas of my entire life? And if I never have another Christmas, I says, I'm going to leave it all in your hands. And I walked out. And my faith was renewed that something beautiful was going to happen. As I walked out of the church, a young man, 25 years old, approached me. And I thought he was going to ask me for instructions how to get somewhere. Instead, he says, Mister, he says, can you spare anything? He says, my wife ran away with a man, and I have a baby and a 3-year-old son at home, and we have nothing to eat. And he sounded very sincere. I reached in my pocket, and I gave him a $5 bill. And he says, God bless you. And I got in the car, and when I got in the car, I says, my God, what have I done? I said, instead of $10, I now have $5. And I'm beginning to lose my faith again. But I said, no, I can't let my thoughts get haywire. So suddenly I turned the radio on, and all my answers came from the radio. I thought. Because the first thing I heard was, have you bought your Christmas tree yet? He says, if you haven't, come to such and such a farm, which was about a mile from my home. Don't forget, we're talking about 22 years ago. He says, bring your own axe and chop your own Christmas tree. For $1, you can still have a Christmas tree at home. So I said, I got $5. If I spend $1 for the Christmas tree, that leaves me $4. I'll grab a couple of my sons and the axe, and we'll go and chop it down. I said, well, that takes care of the Christmas tree now. The turkey dinner. Suddenly, the announcer said, have you tried the brand new restaurant that every family is talking about? It's the first one in Philadelphia. Children just love it. Come to McDonald's. Hamburgers are 10 cents. French fries are 11 cents. Milkshakes are 15 cents. And we had been there once, and I knew my kids loved McDonald's. This was the very first McDonald's restaurant in Philadelphia. It was about 3 miles from my house. So I said, I know what I'll do. I'll gather the children. I said, guess what, kids? We're not going to eat turkey dinner together tomorrow. We're going to go to McDonald's. And I could visualize it jumping up and down. So, oh, boy. So I calculated how many milkshakes Mike would eat and drink and so forth. And I said, that's $2.90. That would leave me at $1.10. My wife and I can eat at home. I said, a sandwich or something. So I said, now toys. Suddenly the radio said, do you know how they celebrate Christmas in Mexico? The toys are not given on Christmas Day. They're given on January the 6th. I said, this is when the 3 wise men came and gave the gifts to the baby infants. It's Christmas in Mexico is celebrated as the birth of our Lord on Christmas Day, but the gifts are given in January. In my mind, I said, the day after Christmas, the toys will be at half price. And I'll get paid again, and I can afford the toys then. So I said, I'll gather the whole family and tell them, guess what? I'm a Mexican. We're going to celebrate Christmas the way Mexican. Well, I felt good. I got home, and the first thing my wife looks at me empty-handed says, where's the tree? Where's the turkey? I says, calm down. I've got all the answers for you. Sir, give me a cup of coffee, and we'll talk. I was just sitting down to have a cup of coffee, and one of my kids came around and says, Dad, there's a policeman outside. I said, oh. So I go up there. I says, what's up? He says, are you the father of 6 children? I said, yeah, anything wrong? He looks over to the police car. There's another cop inside. He says, hey, Harry, this is the house. And I'm looking. He opens up the trunk and takes out a big basket. Inside was a 15-pound turkey. There was eggs, breads, candy, six little stockings full of kind of little toys. And I says, what's this? He says, compliments of the Middletown Police Department. He says, any family with 6 children or more is entitled to one of this. Merry Christmas. I says, Merry Christmas. And my wife looks at me and says, is this possible? I says, with God, everything is possible. So I'm sitting down to drink my coffee when the doorbell rings again, and I get up, and it's Mr. O'Leary, the neighbor across the street. He says, hey, Tony, Merry Christmas. I said, Mr. O'Leary, Merry Christmas to you. I says, what's up? He said, you knew that we had a son in the Navy? I said, yeah. Well, we didn't expect him today. He took a flight out of San Diego. He says, he arrived unexpectedly here in Philadelphia, and guess what? That dumb son of mine, he says, he went out and bought a Christmas tree. We already have one. Can you use a Christmas tree? And he brought it with all the trimmings and the lights, and I said, sure we can. He said, well, have the kids come over. The kids ran out there, and they decorated the Christmas tree. My wife looks at me again and says, what do we do now? I said, we wait for toys. At 10 o'clock that night, the telephone rang. And I answered it, and it was a woman who asked for my wife. And I said, just a minute. My wife says, who is it? I says, I don't know. My wife picks up the phone and says, yes. Yes. Really? You're not kidding? Sure. No, of course. So she hangs up and says, what was all that about? He says, that's the wife of Master Sergeant, some sergeant in the Marine Corps. He's in charge of toys for tots down in Philadelphia. The Marine Corps distributes a lot of toys to the poor children. They take old toys, paint them, renovate them, fix them up. He says that he just got through, my husband just got through distributing all the toys in the area. He still has over 300 toys they don't know what to do with. They want to know if we can come over and take our choice. My wife told her that we would be there at 1 in the morning after midnight mass. My wife and I were up from 1 to 3:30 in the morning bringing toys, and our living room looked like Gimbel's or Macy's department store. We had bicycles, dolls, footballs, games. They were used toys, but the children enjoyed them. And just before we went to bed, I looked at my wife and said, I didn't buy you anything. She says, you didn't? Only the most beautiful Christmas that I've ever experienced in my life, she said. And as I started to take off my pants to go to bed, I reached in my pocket and said, well, I'll be doggone, I still have $5 of it. I cut it right in half, and I gave her $2.50. I said, $2.50 for you and $2.50 for me. Let me say this very seriously, though. Life is beautiful when you want to make it beautiful. Last week, one of my technicians took out one of those little miniature calculators that you see nowadays. And he says, when were you born, Tony? And I gave him my birthday. And in less than 3 seconds, he said, do you know that you've lived in this world 19,867 days? And he walks away. Well, what amazed me was not the rapidity or the fastness of trying to find out how many days, but I said to myself, 19,867 days I've lived in this world. I went home thinking that night, out of those 19,000 and some days, how many of these have I really given myself to others? How many have I really given my love to others or helped others, or myself for that matter? Because one of the most beautiful things that God has given us as a final treasure has been today. Today is the most beautiful day of your entire life. Not tomorrow, not next week, today. And I'm going to give each one of you this prayer that I have in my bedroom wall. I made 500 copies. I hope there's enough for you. And it's just a prayer for today. It's written in Spanish on one side, in English on the other side, and there's my name and address. If you care to write me, I would appreciate it very much, not because I'm Tony Zuniga, not because I need to receive letters, but because my company will not allow me to come to California anymore unless they know what I'm doing in California. They like to know if I'm helping people or sharing with people or whatever. So if you feel free to write me. But anyway, a prayer for today, it says like this. This is the beginning of a new day. God has given me this day to use as I will. I will use it for good because I'm exchanging a day of my life for it. When tomorrow comes, this day will be gone forever, and it will leave in its place something that I have traded for it. I want it to be gain and not loss, good and not evil, success and not failure, in order that I may rejoice in the price that I paid for it. So on the way I pick one of these up, I want to thank you very sincerely, and just remember that God made each one of us beautiful, and if someday you take this whole package, your life, your mind, your friends, your crosses, your giving of yourself to others, you're going to say the same thing that St. Paul said after he was converted on the road to Damascus. I am sure now, God, that neither life nor death, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor might, nor depth, nor any other thing can ever change us from the love of God, that love which is our Lord Jesus Christ. So be it. Thank you, and please pray for me.